I'd like to bring in Jamil Jaffer, who is a former chief counsel and senior advisor for the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and joins you now. Jamil, it's very good of you to take the time. Nice to see you and to hear you again. Well, I can see you anyway. Just, if you will, talk initially about the scale, as we understand it, of these retaliatory strikes against Iran by the US. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Well, the president has said that they would be very strong and very powerful strikes, and there's no doubt that we've hit some significant targets in Iran. But I think that most people actually, if they were really characterizing, would call them measured and focused, in the sense that, obviously the Iranians shot at an American manned helicopter, took down two of the people flying that helicopter. Thankfully, they weren't killed. They were rescued by a drone ship from Saranac. But the real problem is they're shooting at manned vehicles, and we're only getting involved in proportionate and something of a disciplined response. The challenge here, I think, is it's not clear that will knock the Iranians off the effort to continue to go after American targets, allied targets, and the like. We haven't done that yet. They've gone after the Israelis, they've gone after the Emiratis, they've gone after the Kuwaitis, and they're going after us now. I think if the president really wants to send a message to Iran, he'd be hitting them a lot harder, a lot more aggressively, making it a lot clearer that we're not going to take it. The problem, of course, is, as you well know, the president doesn't appear to want to continue this war, and he doesn't want to get into a bigger fight. That's the real challenge we have here.
Well, I mean, how proportionate is what you said actually true? I mean, how proportionate do you think this response is? And clearly he felt that he had to respond because American hardware, although not personnel, fortunately, had been struck. Personnel didn't die. How proportionate do you think the US response in fact is for what's happened here?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that it depends on which side you're on, right? If you're on the American side and you think that they're going after American pilots is unacceptable, then there's nowhere near enough of a response. You need a much more aggressive response to deter the Iranians from doing it again. If you're on the Iranian side or thinking that a larger response would create a larger conflict, then you're like, all right, look, this may have actually been too much. You hit multiple sites, you hit radar sites and the like. You should have taken out one thing. I think at the end of the day, the question is what will it take to, if your goal is to stop the war, right, and to limit casualties, is that achieved by a significant major response that scares the Iranians into doing a deal? Or do you keep doing this sort of nickel and diming back and forth where each side hits each other and the war just continues and continues and continues? I fear that we're in the latter camp rather than we should be in the former camp, which is you shoot at American pilots, you feel severe pain, and that's how we knock you off the idea that it's okay to target American hardware and flyers.
Just before we move on, Jamil, I mean, do we know exactly what happened? Because I read a number of conflicting reports. It wasn't like this thing was shot down by a ground-to-air missile or an air-to-air missile. We've heard that maybe it collided with an Iranian drone. What's the most likely narrative? What's the most likely version of events, do you feel?
Yeah, we don't know exactly what happened, but the Iranian drone that it collided with could have been a surveillance drone, which in case it might have been accidental. But the reality is it could have also been a drone designed to be used as a weapon. The Iranians have been using drones as weapons, as flying bombs. That's been their sort of MO. So it wouldn't be surprising you take that drone, you crash it into, a nuclear power plant or an oil facility or a ship. Nothing different about crashing it into a helicopter, right? You also gives you a little bit of plausible deniability, but you can say, oh, well, look, it was just an accident. It wasn't clear we meant to do it. But what's clear here is the Iranians are playing a very dangerous game, a game that eventually Donald Trump is going to tire of, and he's going to respond aggressively. I don't think he did that here. But, I think that they run the risk that they're playing with somebody who's not afraid to get more aggressive. The question is, when, if at all, will that happen? Right now, he's not doing that. Unclear why. I think in part because, to your point and to what a lot of people have been saying around this thing, is that he doesn't want to get into a larger fight. But the truth is, this is a conflict that we brought to bear on the Iranians after they hit us, dozens and dozens of times over the last dozen years. We finally now brought the fight to them. But it's a fight if you're going to start in a big way like we have. You're going to want to have to win. It's not clear we're prepared to do what it takes to win this fight.
It's difficult, though, isn't it, to quantify what's a proportional response when it could have been an accident. Trump doesn't even know then that whether this was a deliberate act of malicious aggression. If it was an accident, he's just going in and bombing Iranian installations, potentially erroneously.
I mean, look, I suppose there's some possibility this was an accident, right? You can't, the fog of war, you can't say anything with certainty. We don't know. We'll know more over the next few days as the U.S. military looks at their radar picture, tries to understand what happened.
Okay.
But listen, I'm not holding my breath. The Iranians have been shooting at American ships for days, for months. Weeks and months. They've been shooting at Israel recently. They've been shooting at our friends in the Emirates and the Kuwaitis and the Saudis over and over again. So call me skeptical with the idea that those are just some accidental running into a helicopter. Again, it's possible, but I'm skeptical of that. And the reality is that the Iranians have been hitting us enough that it's eventually time to punch back. This may be the time to do that.
Now, Jamil, a couple of days ago, we were hearing that a ceasefire was just days away. I feel like I've heard that time and time again. It's like Groundhog Day. It's the Iranians are talking to us at a very high level. We're really close to peace. They want peace. And then the Iranians say that that's all a load of old nonsense made up by the White House. Is it still the case? Do you believe, from what you know, which is more than what I know, that a ceasefire was just days away before this happened?
Well, here's what's crazy, Richard, is that we are in a ceasefire, right? In theory, the U.S. agreed to a ceasefire weeks ago with Iran, right, where the deal was, we stop bombing you, you open Strait of Hormuz. And everyone said yes, and there was a debate about whether Lebanon was involved or not. Finally, with the Israelis on board, okay, we won't hit Lebanon right now. And so for a period there, the U.S. wasn't bombing Iran, Israel wasn't hitting Lebanon, and guess what happened in the Strait of Hormuz? Nothing. The Iranians didn't reopen it. They kept guarding it. They kept saying it's a $2 million toll. You got to coordinate with us. So the Iranians never kept it their part of the ceasefire deal. So in a lot of ways, I guess, it's a lot like that old Charlie Brown cartoon where Lucy keeps putting the football in there, and as Charlie Brown runs up to it, she pulls the football away and he goes flat on his back. The question is, when is Donald Trump going to get tired of being Charlie Brown flat on his back with the Iranians pulling the football away? He's going to say, okay, they don't really want a deal. We need to go back to war. The problem is the president doesn't want to do that. The Iranians know it, and so they keep playing Lucy to President Trump's Charlie Brown, and that's the fundamental problem here.
So I'd forgotten about that cartoon until you mentioned it, but yeah, I can see it now in my mind's eye. But nonetheless, we've had ceasefires and with, great pomp and bells and whistles, and isn't Mr. Trump fantastic? Give the man another Nobel Peace Prize, And, Israel have semi-abided by it, whilst at the same time bombing Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. And, really, in fact, they're contravened the ceasefire. So Israel aren't playing fully by the game. They're not playing fully by the ceasefires that are announced.
Well, look, part of the problem is that Hezbollah isn't part of this whole deal, right? The Israelis are negotiating with the Lebanese government, which isn't Hezbollah and is opposed to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is occupying the southern part of the country. They're supported by Iran. They're launching attacks in Israel. Israel's responding. Israel says there's a threat there. They're a terrorist group. We understand. We agree they're a terrorist group. The Iranians have now basically made clear. We've always known they backed Hezbollah. We've always known that Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy group. Now Iran has made it transparently clear because they said an attack on Hezbollah is an attack on Iran. All right, so now we got it. Now it's just Iran on Israel's northern border in southern Lebanon launching attacks. So that's the real problem. You can't have Iranian proxies attacking Israel and expect, Benjamin Netanyahu or any Israeli prime minister to sit by and watch that happen. It's never going to happen. No matter what the U.S. says, they're going to punch back because they're being hit already and people are being killed. And so, call it what you want, but Israel's not really part of the deal. And the Lebanese state certainly isn't a real negotiator in this, unfortunately for them. The real party is Iran and Hezbollah, and they're the ones violating the ceasefire because they're the ones attacking northern Israel.
Nonetheless, it means that violence in the region, in very close proximity to borders where ceasefires have been arranged, is still continuing, and I think that can only destabilise the process. Just finally, we passed it feels like longer, I have to say, Jamil, but 100-day milestone for the Iran conflict. Do you think that it's feasible that we might see a ceasefire, and by a ceasefire I mean a real one that will actually last for more than a couple of days, before day 150, day 200? If and when do you think that might be achieved? Just finally.
Yeah, look, I think there's a possibility that we can get to a ceasefire. I think what a ceasefire, though, a real ceasefire would take, it would take the Iranians actually being willing to open the Strait of Hormuz. It would take the Iranians being willing to actually give up their nuclear weapons program, give up that enriched uranium, the 600 kilograms or whatever, 440 kilograms, pardon me, of 60% enriched uranium, even more of less enriched uranium, around 20%. Remember, 60% enriched uranium is like 90% of the way to a nuclear weapon. That's the problem, is when you enrich it a certain amount, it's closer to a nuclear weapon by a significant amount more than that. So they've got to give that up. They're not ready to do that. And what it may take to get them there is additional pressure on them, whether it's the blockade and or more strikes. So the problem is probably more war in the immediate future, a long-term solution, if and when the Iranians realize they're not going to win this conflict.
A ceasefire is about compromise, isn't it? You know, if Iran are going to do that, what concessions will the US make on their part?
The concession is no more attacks on Iran, right? I mean, like, that's look, the deal is, if you want to be a nuclear weapons state and you're opposed to U.S. interests and you support terrorist groups like Hezbollah, and we've decided we're going to get in a war with you, the only deal on the table is you give in, you give up your program. There's no middle ground here of you get to keep a nuclear weapon, you get to keep, or nuclear weapons capability, you get to keep enriching uranium domestically. Donald Trump made clear from day one he didn't like the Obama nuclear deal, which allowed for enrichment, right? So if he agrees to that or something less than that, he ends up the loser in the whole deal. And whatever you think about Donald Trump, he doesn't like being the loser. He doesn't like being viewed that way.
No, he doesn't.
And so I think that's the hard part.
He throws his toys out of the pram. So the way Iran stands is, you downgrade your uranium stocks, or we continue to bomb. That's the deal that's facing them effectively.
I think that's right. Yes, and for better or for worse, they knew that going in. They estimated they could survive the bombings. By the way, it turns out they were right about that. And they estimated Donald Trump didn't have the stomach to stay in the fight if they got oil prices raised up. And it turns out they might have been right about that too. And that's the fundamental problem. Where they think they have him by the they're gonna leverage that, and he's got to demonstrate to them he's not going to take it. And, Donald Trump might actually do that. The problem is right now he's not quite there yet. The thing the Iranians have to be careful of is they're pushing him to an edge, and this is not a man you really want to push to the edge. Whatever you think of him, like him, hate him, you don't want to push that guy to the edge. It's going to be ugly for you. And so, that's where they're teeing up for.
Jamil Jaffer, thanks very much indeed. Former Chief Counsel and Senior Advisor for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee.